Describe it.
Good.
Yeah. Even if it doesn't.
Hi, good evening. I hate to have my back to all of you, but we're kind of addressing many formats tonight, both Zoom and a webinar and in person. So welcome everyone to our third community engagement this evening. I'm the current board president, Joan Ensign, and I'm just going to kick us off tonight. There we go. And then we have two experts here that I'm going to turn the meeting over to in a few minutes. So you can kind of click ahead. As I said, I'm board president. We have most of the board here this evening. Mark Hetzel is our vice president. Judy Engebretson is secretary clerk. Jack Heineman over here is our treasurer. And we have two of our directors here and one on webinar, Ted Fry and David Betcher and Brian Hafer on a webinar. So we began the community engagement discussion way back almost a year ago as a priority for this board. And this is our third engagement this year. We had one in September on diversity. We had one in November on student achievement. Tonight you're going to be hearing about referendum options and the important decisions that we're facing and discussing as we move toward a referendum in November. So we're here tonight to kind of look at those issues, and as I said, I'm going to turn it over to Randy and Steve, and they're going to kind of present to you where we've been, where we are, and kind of where we're going in those issues. So. Gentlemen?
Great. Thank you, Joan.
You're welcome.
For those of you who don't know us, my name is Randy Gutenberg, Superintendent for Waunakee Community School District. This is Steve Summers, our Executive Director of Operations. And tonight what we are going to do is walk through a lot of information. So there's going to be some things in here that you're going to see that go back to our planning starting in 2019. And then some of our current thoughts with regards to referendum planning and facility planning that you've probably seen presented over the last number of months at the school board. But tonight we really want to use this as a kickoff to the conversations that are surrounding facility planning and referendum fall 2022. And I'll be covering the majority of the presentation on the facility side, and then the last part of our presentation will be a little bit on some of the finances and the survey pieces that we're going to be bringing to the community. Since we are running out of multiple formats tonight, what I want to just give all of our participants an opportunity of how you can interact with us this evening. At the end of our program tonight, or end of our presentation, people who are live in the room will be able to come up to the microphone here to my right and present and ask your questions, and we'll be happy to try to answer those, or if you have any comments that you want to share as well, we'll be happy to hear those. If you are joining us on YouTube, and watching the live stream, then you're able to send us emails. I think the email that Annie put out was wcSD_communications@waunakee.k12.wi.us. So that is a piece you can email us. And those of you who are joining us via the webinar will be able to either drop your questions into the Q&A as on the very top where Annie is running the cursor right now. So we'll be able to answer those, and we'll pick those up probably at the end of our presentation. There were also a number of questions that were submitted prior to the meeting, and Steve and I have gone through, we've inserted them generally in our presentation, and we'll try to highlight when we're answering one of those questions so that you can see them in the context of our conversation. But tonight, as Joan had said, our goal tonight is really to give you a high-level overview of all the different pieces that we are looking at, particularly around facilities, as they relate to a November 22 referendum. The first place we need to begin, though, is a little bit with our history. And we want to give you kind of a walkthrough of what's occurred. Certainly there's a lot of history in Waunakee before 2010, but when we start to look at the children that we're impacting, generally some of the kids that are either at the very end of their career with us, would have potentially remembered some of the things that occurred in 2010 that are leading up until now. And then we'll also tonight be talking about phases that will be moving us into the future. But as a piece of review, in 2010 we had a referendum. It had two parts to it. One was for a new elementary school, And the other part was for an addition to the high school. So this was the piece that added the second level to the high school and also opened up and expanded our cafeteria area. That's the part of the referendum that passed. And when we went out to the community and asked the question as far as what they didn't feel comfortable with regards to the elementary part of that referendum, their feedback was pretty specific. It says, we really would like to see an established long-range plan so that we know exactly what's not only happening now, but what's coming in the future. So between 2010 and 2013, we established our long-range master plan. For those of you who were around for those conversations, that's where we vetted out things like size of schools, grade configurations, location of schools, and tried to get really a sense of what did the community want. And that led to the 2014 referendum and the process that went into building the current intermediate school, supporting our current grade configurations of K4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. We also did some renovations at Heritage Elementary and added an addition onto Prairie. One of the things that we shared with the community at that time was that was really phase one of our long-range plan, and that there would be multiple phases beyond that as we monitored growth in our community, and that's part of what we're here to talk about this evening. After the 2014 referendum passed and that construction was completed, and we moved our students from the fully had Heritage take over the intermediate school down on South Street, and students occupy the new intermediate school out on Woodland, we then moved the portable classroom unit that was behind the intermediate school, we moved it over to the middle school. That has 2 classrooms in it. That was our initial move in order to accommodate some of the growth that was happening at the middle level. And after that, we then started in 2019-20 for the board to start considering phase 2 of our master planning options. And as part of that, that was really looking at Heritage and the middle school were primary drivers of those discussions. And those remain true to our conversations tonight. You will see that there's a few things that have shifted as we've started to live through that master plan from 2014 forward, and we'll point those out to you this evening. But obviously in 2020, we also ran into the challenges that came forward with COVID-19. And the board at that point decided that this was a time we needed to pause our master planning and a referendum, which was initially planned for 2020, and to get through those challenges that our community as a whole was going through. So as part of that, that's really what's bringing us here this evening, is we started that planning last January to reinvigorate our process and kicked off where we left in February of 2020. This summer, or I guess late last spring, the board also approved purchasing a second portable classroom unit behind the middle school. So there's 2 units, there's 2 classrooms in each one, so there's 4 classrooms in the back of the middle school that are helping to accommodate students on a daily basis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But tonight what we are doing is we're really in the last bullet point and updating and launching our long-range master plan moving forward. For those of you who followed along over the last number of years, we work with a gentleman by the name of Mark Roffers. Mark is an urban planner, and he works on helping us to get a sense of what's happening within our community to help us give a better idea of what our enrollment projections will look like. He uses a housing growth model to project out enrollment and changes within our community, and then looks at housing units and how many students are generally coming out of each type of housing unit across our community. And those were the pieces that if you've seen some of his work before, he's broken our school district. On the map on the left is showing kind of the geography of our school district and our boundaries. And the one on the right is just showing that he's broken up our community into multiple, much smaller scale segments of which he can do a deeper dive into looking at exactly what's happening with housing in those areas. And through that, he then brings forth his enrollment projections and growth projections for us to then extrapolate forward as part of our planning process. And I know Steve works with Mark very, very closely as we do our 3rd Friday counts in September and our 2nd Friday counts in January, which are 2 points when the school district counts our students for Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction purposes. So as we take a look at those projections, one of a few things that we just need to take a look at. First of all, our housing market in Waunakee is very strong. It does attract many families, and that growth allows us to, the growth in housing units allows us to stay above the curve for lower birth rates. So when you take a look across the county, across the state, you're seeing birth rates have really stayed status quo, regardless of what the size of our community, even though our community has grown, our birth rates are not growing at the same rate. And in fact, they're staying relatively static. So what's occurring is that we are growing as a result of not only the birth rates that are happening, but also people moving into our community. So as we take a look at that, we had 150 single-family homes permitted in the early 2000s. Those houses are now approaching 30 years old. And as we start to have turnover, those are some of the things that Mark is watching as far as what's occurring with housing units within our community. Our enrollment growth right now is approaching 100 students per year on a K-12 basis. Part of what Mark's report was to the board here just a few weeks ago was between 2021 and 2035. During that time period, we're expected to increase our enrollment K through 12 by 1,380 students. So that's a projection of about 95 to 100 students per year. And that by 2035 will bring our enrollment up to 5,500 students. Right now we're at about 3,400 students district-wide, and that includes our 4K. You can see that we are going to continue to see growth per the projections that Mark has put forward. The one thing that we have included in these projections is keeping our open enrollment numbers really relatively static as far as what we're seeing today, so we're not making many changes with regards to what we anticipate from there. And as we said, we are not including 4K in this because they're not housed within our current Waunakee School District buildings. So let's jump into some of the projections. And we're going to take a look at this from a K-4 perspective and then a 6-12 perspective. And the piece I want to draw your attention to here is these are numbers looking at where students are within their resident enrollment districts. So for example, we have a boundary for elementary, for Arboretum School, Heritage School, and Prairie School. The footnote at the bottom says these projections assume no forced transfers between the elementary schools. We run a shuttle system amongst our elementary schools where we do move kids from one attendance boundary to another, mainly to balance off class sizes. So when you take a look at Arboretum School, our enrollment for this fall was 435, and you can see that all of a sudden you jump very quickly to a red number of 508. That's not including some of the students that we move out, or that includes all the kids that live within that attendance boundary, but we move a number of students around the district because of class sizes within Arboretum Elementary. So that number even shows like, well, that should be your point of contention here. But really we have space in our other buildings where we're moving kids to. As Steve has pointed out on several occasions to the board, we actually move kids between all of our schools. With our shuttle system, we have kids from Prairie going to each of the other ones, and same with Heritage. But when you take a look at this piece, what it really is pointing to is that our elementary enrollment is really not going to become a significant issue until we get past 25, 26. So sometime between 2025, 2026, and 2030, 2031 is when you have a need for a fourth elementary school. But as you'll see tonight, we're not talking for this fall's referendum about a fourth elementary school. We're asking about what should we do with Heritage Elementary. So a fourth elementary would be part of what I would consider phase 3. Otherwise, a conversation that a board will have to have somewhere between 2025 and 2030. But in 2022, we're really looking at what do we want to do with Heritage? And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's in the conversation here in a few minutes. And what do we want to do with our middle school? But the driver for Heritage isn't necessarily the enrollment piece. If we want to add more students at Heritage, there would be the requirement that we have to add some additional classrooms or update some of the classrooms there that were vacated by the intermediate students when they left to make them more viable for how we deliver our instruction there. And that'll be a piece that I'll show you as far as our conversations that we left off in 2019-20. This is just another illustration that shows on a graphic level as far as when we hit capacities. The yellow mark is obviously kind of the top of our capacity range. And again, you can see in the late 2025, 2030 is when you start to increase above that mark. When you move into the 5 through 12 enrollment projections, the intermediate school generally has some space until we get into the early 2030s. The middle school, however, starts to get into challenges in the very near future. So this is really the driver of our conversations around the referendum. Our capacity number there right now is 663 kids. We have 652 students there. We actually could put those 652 students within the main campus of the middle school without the portables, but our classroom sizes would be at their maximum level, and it would not operate the way we would want it to educationally. So the support the board has provided with bringing in the portable classroom units, the 4 classrooms out back, have really allowed us to bring class sizes down and make that more manageable. This year's 7th grade and this year's 6th grade are our 2 largest classes in the district. So as those 2 classes move through the middle school, we absolutely need those portables in order to keep our class sizes manageable. And then after those move through, we'll be watching our elementary enrollment, of which is triggered by a kindergarten class that came in this year at close to 300 students. So as those kindergarten class grows over time, it is going to cause us to be at a point where we need to address things at the middle school. And it also, as we look at our elementary numbers, they continue to creep up because that's where we're continuing to see our growth. The high school numbers are certainly showing our growth that's occurring there as well, and that too becomes more of an issue as we get into the 25 to early 2030 timeframe. So really the purpose that we want to show you here is that middle school is really one of the driving points of our conversations this evening. Again, just taking a look at it from a graphics perspective, if that works for you, this is grades 5 through 6. Grades 7 and 8, and grades 9 through 12. So let's talk about the relationship of that to our facility needs. As we start to look at our new housing plus the accelerated turnover of neighborhoods like Savannah Village and Southbridge, it does increase the stress that we will have on Arboretum Elementary, which will probably precipitate us continuing to move students to other schools through our shuttle system. Now remember, Arboretum was built as a 4-track school. That was, back at the time when it was constructed, that was really the objective of the community, was to have more elementaries smaller in size. When we went through that process of talking to the community in 2014, the desire was to have larger schools, 6-track schools, more like Prairie size, where you could have fewer schools larger in size. So that parameter piece has shifted over time. So one of the things that we are doing with Arboretum is we are supporting the students who are in those attendance areas as we, through our shuttle system, and moving students out. Also, as pointed out here in the second bullet point, smaller projects, otherwise projects to try to manage the growth in students over the short term, could be accomplished at Heritage and the middle school with some minor facility needs. The issue is with that is it doesn't really fit into a long-range planning context for those schools. So one of the conversations we're having about Heritage is that building is our oldest building. It's been added on to, I believe, 12 to 14 times. From a structural standpoint, it has some challenges with the amount of needs that it has from a facility maintenance standpoint, an energy efficiency standpoint, et cetera. And trying to make it work as a modern learning environment is extremely challenging, if not something that is not something we can overcome. So one of the conversations you'll see in a few minutes is it worth putting the dollars into Heritage, given some of its challenges, if it's not going to be a part of a realistic long-range vision for the community? So that's a piece that we're going to be talking about. And for the middle school, I think that was a question I received prior, was can we add on to the middle school? And I think part of what we're looking at there is certainly that could again be part of a short-term vision. If there's not a lot of great options for how to add on to it, but it also, the community has really felt strongly about keeping their high school in the middle of town in the current location. And we see the current middle school building being part of a campus in our phase 3 of our facility planning process. So once a new middle school is built, the current middle school becomes part of the high school campus. And I know there was a question about utilization, which I'll answer later on in the presentation. As we go on to the third bullet point here, there is a need for significant capacity expansion at the middle and elementary levels between 25 and 29. And a successful referendum in 2022 will start to bring forth some of the construction completion in time to meet the needs of our student growth that's occurring. So a past referendum in 2022 is going to be at least a couple years up to a 5-year build out in order for us to put schools in place that actually start to address those enrollment issues I've just finished talking about. So just kind of to reiterate a few things that we've done. Enrollment for this school year, we increased by 85 students. We have the 2 portable trailer classrooms out behind the middle school, which is actually 4 classrooms and 2 units. We're still, we continue to be an attractive community for families to move to. We continue to monitor our growth. And one of the things Steve pointed out to us is we just completed our second Friday in January student count, and we added 28 additional net of students between September and January. And that's one of the largest increases that we've had on a net level in recent years. So that's a piece that shows that we are continuing to move forward and grow as a student population. So let's move a little bit into now the facility planning pieces. You've kind of seen where our growth needs are. Definitely driven by pieces around the middle school, and then looking at longer term needs as far as what we're going to do with heritage. So let's talk about where we are with our facility planning. There's really 3 parts to this. 1 is the enrollment growth we discovered. 2 is modern learning environments. And 3rd is capital maintenance projects. We'll talk about some of these tonight. The board established some planning principles as we went into the 2014 referendum. The board also approved these and looked at these as we went into the 2022 planning process, and I think they hold true. We're going to continue to plan on long-range enrollment growth. We're going to look at a long-range approach to facility planning so that we have multiple steps that we can articulate out to the community as far as what comes next. We want to continue to look at flexible and focused, future-ready learning environments. We want to be equitable in our facilities across the district so that we have schools that have similar type of facilities for students regardless of where you live in the community. Address our capital maintenance, deliver value to our taxpayers, and reflect our community values. Those were pieces that we felt were really important back in 2014, and they continue to be important to us today. For those of you who are just wondering what we mean by modern learning environments, this is a snapshot of one of our areas at the intermediate school, our 5-6 building. The way we teach our students today is really much in a collaborative space environment. Small groups, flexible adaptive learning so that we can move furniture around, have kids grouping in different places, sight lines so teachers can circulate through and have groups in different locations and still have adequate supervision. And spaces that are equitable for all of our learners so that we can bring all of our students together in one space, whether you are receiving some remedial instruction, some advanced learning opportunities, or you're part of the general classroom and the work that's occurring there. So when we look at modern learning environments, it goes from anything from the facilities design to furniture that we're using that help to match how we instruct our kids today. So let's take a little bit of a step back in time and look where we left off in March of 2020. I'm at the point where we slowed our process of planning for a referendum that was initially planned for the year 2020. We'd identified a number of different pathways and options, particularly both around heritage and the middle school. So I want to take us back to some of the things that we looked at early on and give you some of the feedback that the board had really concluded right before we took a pause. So there were a few of these options that I'm going to present tonight that the board took off the table for various reasons, and I'll try to hit those at a high level. So looking at the at our heritage site, and just to kind of give you some orientation of it, I'm going to use my pointer here, and Annie, you can follow me. So if I'm on the left-hand side, you've got, this is the Heritage Building, and you have South Street right here. You have the Catholic Church up in this area. And then behind Heritage is there's an old track. This used to be the old high school. So you have the track facilities, you have green space back here. This site is used for multiple things. This is obviously our Heritage Elementary purposes for instruction right now. But when we look at its close adjacency to the middle school, our middle school track kids come behind here to start their practices. They're obviously on our high school track as well, but between our high school and our middle school students, they do share space. And then this area back here is also utilized by our other sports programs at the middle school, such as our middle school football program. So that's an important piece when we start to look at middle school needs, because this current site that we have for Heritage is utilized instructionally for our K-4 students in the Heritage attendance area, but it's also used by some of our middle school students for their after-school extracurriculars. So option one that was put out here was really just to renovate the entire building. And one of the pieces that we looked at with Heritage as far as the renovation was really listening to our architects, our engineers, our custodians, and our maintenance team. We said there are really a lot of the parts of this building that are just beyond life. We still have some of the electrical pieces running in the tunnels below. You have univents for your HVAC programs, and just how it was built and added onto several times make parts of this building not utilized and not accessible to some of our students, and not something that we can adapt to the type of learning environment that we want. So as we took a look at a full renovation back in 2020, when we started to narrow our options, the board eliminated this option. Option number two was to take the area that was furthest to the north on Heritage to tear that part of the school down and then add a new section to it. So in this case, the orange represents an instructional space here, and then a new facility for for gymnasium space, etc. The board also eliminated this piece from the respect of, you start to look at how this is laid out from an instructional standpoint. You have kindergartners down here having to travel all the way to the end of the building for some of their needs for specials classes, art class, music class, etc. And just looking at also, did that really address all of our needs as far as our learning environment pieces, similar to the conversation we had in option one? And at that point in time, the board said they did not believe that that was the best option for us. This was also one, as we talked to just the functionality of this with our Heritage staff, there was feedback just on the challenges of trying to navigate through that school and to make that work feasibly and well for the instructional needs. Option three was to remove some additional parts and to tear down a larger part of the school. So the part that would remain here is the one that has the archway in front of it. It's kind of the main part of Heritage Elementary. And then what we would do is we would add on to the back of Heritage. So this maintains about a third of the current building, and then adds on to the back side of it to create some instructional space. Now certainly then this one does meet more of our instructional needs. It does maintain part of the older building, which still has some maintenance concerns associated with it that we would have to address. But it certainly was kind of a compromise between option four, which was to reconstruct an entirely new Heritage on the Heritage site. So if there's a desire to keep an elementary school in the center of town, which has been feedback we've heard, an option could be to build the Heritage building behind the current Heritage. When that construction is complete, You then tear down the other building and you have more of your green space and parking out front. You still maintain some of the track and some of those pieces in the back. Now, I think when we had this discussion back in early 2020, and we started to do some costing of things, the delta between 3 and 4 wasn't very great. And I think that there was a conversation amongst the board, and we'll revisit this as we move forward with our planning, particularly if there's a desire to keep an elementary school on the site as far as where we would want to go. But there was generally some thoughts that option 4 may be the better long-term option. But that's definitely a piece we still need some additional feedback on. There was a 5th option that was thrown out that was put out there by the board for us to consider, which was, well, what if we didn't put heritage on the current heritage site and we moved it out to the intermediate site? Now, if you remember during the 2014 referendum, we stated that this site out on Woodland Drive, and this is Woodland Drive right here. This is the current intermediate school, the newer intermediate school. And then we also have, this is a 40-acre site, so our initial idea was to put a middle school here. But one of the options that the board brought forward is, what if we put our elementary school there? It's still within the heritage boundaries, so it doesn't change our elementary attendance boundaries. It just shifts it to another part of the boundary area and puts heritage out here. Now, the reason that that was brought forward, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the middle school in just a second, is when we start to look at our dismissal times, the intermediate school and the middle school are on the same start and end time. So our busing schedule is the same. We all know right now, just from our lived experience with the intermediate school on Woodland Drive, that there's a lot of traffic out there. Significant traffic in the morning, significant traffic after school. And to put a middle school here would also cause some challenges potentially with traffic without shifting. I mean, you can always look at the bell times as one option. But it also looks at how does a school fit on that site. And I'll show you in a few minutes of what that looks like with a middle school there. But an elementary school may be an option to consider out at the intermediate school simply because of how it fits on the site and makes that site function. Because we don't have to have with an intermediate area anything associated with after-school extracurricular activities. We have space for playgrounds, etc. So the difference that we'll be taking a look at is the options, and this is one to keep in mind, is one of the key questions is going to be, where do you want a middle school to be? You know, and one of the options is, if you want to keep heritage in the center of town, then the middle school has to go somewhere else. But I'll also be presenting you an option in a minute that if you're open to moving heritage out by the intermediate school, the current heritage site could be a place where a middle school would be located because of, again, its adjacency to the current high school and with the additional green space that exists behind it. So your heritage options are really narrowed down right now from my perspective to option 3, which is some renovation and an addition to heritage. 2, a construction of heritage on the current site but behind the school. Or 3, the heritage being constructed on another site, potentially right next to the intermediate school. Okay. Now let's take a look at the middle school. Because as I shared with you, the middle school is one of our drivers here, because that's the area where we're having the increase in enrollment that is causing us some space challenges. So one of the options that we took a look at, and this is what option number 1 here is here on the left, is to place the middle school right next to the intermediate school. So this was really trying to take a look at generally what would a new 800 student school look like that's expandable up to 1,000. Now I say expandable because when we built the intermediate school, right here, this little spot right there is actually a future addition to the intermediate school. So the concept that we heard from the community was, if you build a school, build it so that future growth can be added onto. So that was part that was incorporated in to the intermediate school concept. The reason that this option was, I think, kind of removed from consideration was By the time we get the middle school built, it would already be time for it to already be potentially at that next size. So one of the options would be that you would build a school that would be more at the 900 to 1,000 student range. Now, when you start to do that, you can see why the board board eliminated this option, mainly because they just didn't feel like it fit well on the site at that size. You don't have any of the green space around it to support some of their extra and co-curricular programs, and also the concerns that you have just with your traffic flow. So that was where their thought was on the previous slide when I showed you kind of how the elementary school fit there. An elementary school seems to fit better on that 40-acre site, which was part of the conversation that we were having. And when we were looking at the middle school, the whole concept of it sitting at the intermediate school site just seemed like it just didn't fit well geographically. Now, option 3 was, well, what happens if you do build a heritage elementary out next to the intermediate school? Well, then we have the lot that would be vacated by Heritage, and that's the whole option 3 here, is you could put the middle school where Heritage currently sits. That still keeps the school in the center of town, and it keeps the middle school adjacent to the high school and also to some of these additional fields. So that's why I say the middle school is really the determining factor here. That's our driver. And the question is, where would you want to site a middle school? Now, I believe there's a few options. One of them is certainly out next to the intermediate school, or not next to one of them is at the Heritage site. And then an option that we have that's not drawn up here, but is yet to be vetted out, we're going to be talking about this at a future facilities committee, is option 4, asterisk on the bottom, is construction of the middle school on a yet to be determined site. So that would be another piece of land that would not be in one of the pieces that we own. Because we own some land out on Woodland Drive and Peaceful Valley Parkway. That's 24 acres. That's large enough for us to build an elementary school, and it may be a piece that might be good for consideration for a 4th elementary school at some point in the future. But it's not large enough for us to do the type of work that we would do with a middle school and some of the adjacencies that we would need to have attached to it. So your middle school options are really, where do you want the middle school to sit? Do you want it to be kind of closer in adjacency to the high school, which would make sense to consider the Heritage site? Or do you want the middle school situated on another site yet to be determined? That'd be a piece we have to vet out here in the next number of months. So that it would most likely be kind of on the outside or on the outskirts of town, or right adjacent to the sides of town, in a place yet to be determined. So that's going to be a piece Steve's going to talk about in a little bit, about a survey that we'll be putting out to the community. Some other things we've talked about related to this referendum is looking at the high school. Now, I spoke a few minutes ago that once the middle school is built, the current middle school building will become part of the high school campus. And I truly believe that the best place for the broad spectrum of work that would need to complete that project is probably a phase 3 question. But there are some things in phase 2 that I think are important to do. Because as we look at our high school, there are some areas like the original auditorium, the small odd, our welding labs, our shops, and some of our lab areas that just need to be upgraded so that we can expand those programs, create some additional sight lines, so that we can do some instruction in a little bit different way. If you look at our welding lab, it's very much tucked into a back corner of our metals lab, and I think there's ways that we can improve that and help us with our functionality, particularly as we start to articulate some of those programs with MATC. New furniture, particularly some things like in our library to make it a more welcoming place for kids where they want to be and hang out. Functions of the library have changed a lot since that facility was built. There are more places where kids hang out, where they do some collaborative learning. And the old kind of library type tables are just not conducive to some of the kind of works that we do in libraries these days. We're also looking at creating a larger group instruction area where you could bring larger groups of kids together. That wouldn't necessarily be large enough that you need them in an auditorium, but you want to have where you can break them out, but still have, combine a few classes together, and also a training room that we could utilize across the district for our staff. One of the areas I'm going to point at down here by the pool, because the family changing and toileting room is really associated with our pool area, because right now we have a men's restroom, a women's restroom, but if you have a student with special needs that maybe needs support from one of their parents, there's not really a good option for them to be able to do that. So wanting to create kind of a family changing area, I think would be very positive in that respect as well. An area that's not bullet pointed here, and it should be right here, is actually, this is Warrior Stadium, and the bottom that I'm pointing to at the very bottom here, Annie, thank you, in addition to the stadium seating. I mean, when you take a look at our larger events that take place out there, it's standing room only. We have our band right now on Football Fridays on the track, which is not ideal. So looking at ways that we can expand those pieces. You also see kind of the remnants of an orange piece down here. This was actually something that we had initially kind of conceptualized. It's not included in the scope of what we're talking about for 2022, but it was like, how do you connect the high school to the middle school, and what are some of the discussions about how do you utilize that space? I think that's a phase 3 question as far as how we would actually do some of those pieces, but definitely these options at the high school are going to service our students moving forward. And there's a few items that have come forward that we want to further explore with the board, such as if you've watched any of our activities, our band concerts, our sporting events, we have a video class that's going to be doing a great job of live streaming events for us. And they just could use a different type of a learning environment for that class, which is doing awesome things. So high school has some upgrades we'd like to do, and then I see phase 3 as being kind of a piece where we would talk about how the high school and the middle school coexist together. A few minor projects here. This is the little building that we call the Teaching and Learning Center. It sits between the old library and the high school. Right now it houses our alternative ed programs in the upper level, food service in the lower level, and also our 18 to 21-year-old special ed program, transition program in the lower level. Some things that we would like to see at the point in time when a new middle school would be built and we would start to have now space at the current middle school site is moving some of those programs over. The alternative ed program is a potential. Also a potential move would be our 18 to 21-year-old program. We currently have an off-site clinic for our staff, which we would like to move from rental property into property that we own, and the lower level of the TLC building would be a good use for that. So we're looking at how we can really kind of move some of our programs around to better utilize the space that we control and we own, and also control our costs. And you kind of look at this from a long-range planning perspective. Phase 1 was the 2014 referendum. It was the addition to Prairie, the heritage renovation. We had maintenance that was part of that, and the new intermediate school. And then we had a question to exceed the revenue caps for operational purposes. That whole referendum came in together at $44.8 million plus the exceed the revenue cap number. Phase 2, this is kind of needs to be updated a little bit because this was built off of our 2020 concept, but many of these pieces still exist. I would say the heritage renovation part on part 2, I think that's also a piece that also has a slash or building a new heritage. The second part is a new middle school, and then looking at the current middle school and high school and how that's going to become one campus. I think we're now thinking that there are a few things we want to do to upgrade the middle school or the high school programs, but probably that whole concept of how they operate together and any of the connecting features of that may be part of a future phase 3 referendum effort. We also then need to look at district-wide facility maintenance. For those of you who are in person out here, you're at the district offices. We are maxed out with our office space out here. Behind our walls over here, we actually have storage space. We're wanting to create some additional office space that'll be part of this conversation too. A relatively minor project in consideration of the rest. And then also an exceed the revenue cap question that would help us with operations, programs, and staffing of programs moving forward to keep our programs at the level that we expect here in Waunakee. The phase 3, which is kind of the yet to be determined, in my mind holds a few different cards. I think that is a piece that would look at a fourth elementary. I think that includes when you start to look at adding on to the current intermediate school, because that building can be added on to. And then the third part of that, what am I missing, Steve? The adding on to the intermediate, fourth elementary, the intermediate, I think those are the two pieces there. But that's, oh, and then completing that high school campus, the middle school and high school campus. So I think that's a phase 3 piece. So what we're looking at today and for the fall of 2022 is really this box, and we need to update a few of those pieces to, again, focus on a renovated heritage or a new heritage, a new middle school, moving really this slide to more of just updates at the high school, and then maintenance, district office, and exceeding the revenue caps. And with that, I'm going to conclude my part of reviewing kind of the facilities planning piece, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve, who's going to talk about some of the financial aspects that are associated with this type of work.
Thank you, Randy. I think the first thing that's important to share with the community is that the school board has been engaged in financial planning for a referendum for many years now. So this isn't a recent change. This has been a long-term plan by the school board to be prepared for a potential referendum. And as an example, the school board has had a goal of a consistent property tax rate across multiple school years. That's not easy to accomplish, yet the school board in Waunakee has been able to accomplish that in recent years. Some examples of decisions that the school board has made is a $2.1 million debt defeasance or paying down debt that took place 3 fiscal years ago. 2 years ago, the board engaged the community in a request to have an operational referendum question for $2.1 million. In the fall of 2020, the school board explained to the community that the tax rate would remain the same if the community would support that referendum. You can see on the chart in front of you that in fact that is what happened. The tax rate remained at $10.86 when that referendum was approved by the community. This past fall is another example. The school board approved almost $5 million in a plan to pay down debt that we will be taking care of this spring as a part of our financial planning. So the community should be aware of the fact that the board has been planning for many years now for the potential for a referendum, and therefore we are well positioned financially to support whatever plan comes out of this discussion over the next 5 to 6 months. Some questions that we expect to be receiving from the public is, how is a consistent tax rate accomplished by the school board across years? The school board has been utilizing a combination of different strategies to accomplish that goal. Examples include paying down debt. Another example that many board members are aware of is the board made the decision to just pay off the loan for the building that we're in right now. We did have a loan on Bethel Circle. The board decided to pay it off. So the board has consistently been paying down debt, which results in interest cost savings for the community. The board has done an outstanding job of taking advantage of low interest rates when issuing new debt. There are strategies that we can look at through debt issuance to really take advantage of the rules that exist to obtain the lowest possible interest rates that we can for public borrowing for schools. Other examples that the board has looked at is issuing debt across multiple fiscal years, which spreads out the cost over a longer period of time. public schools under Wisconsin state law can borrow for 20 years. That's the maximum. Home mortgages are typically 30 years, but when we pay down debt for schools, we're limited to 20 years. The school board has maximized that 20-year window under which debt can be paid. And throughout the time that I have worked in Waunakee, the board has had a goal of spreading out debt so that new residents to the community will also help pay for the schools that are being constructed for today's students. So that's called spreading out the debt, taking advantage of the 20-year opportunity to pay back that debt. It's always important to note for the community that the consistent tax rate across school years still results in changes in any one individual's personal property tax bill or business property tax bill. And there's a few reasons for that. Tax shifts occur between all of the municipalities that we have in our community. So our school district is made up of multiple municipalities, and every year, school board members see the changes that take place. One of our municipalities, that would be the city of Middleton, continues to become larger and larger because of the growth that's occurring in the Bishops Bay community. As a result of that, that community is receiving a larger share of the school district's tax levy. So changes occur between municipalities. It's also important to note that changes occur within municipalities. There's new construction. Existing construction could have changes when you add a basement remodeling or an expansion. Property value changes across time. There is a school levy credit that comes from the state of Wisconsin that can change from one year to the next. So it's always important to state that the board can control the aspect of the tax rate. Then there's other elements that happen as the property tax levy is distributed. So it's just important for community members to keep in mind when we talk consistent tax rate, that doesn't mean every property in our community will have the exact same bill from one year to the next. It does vary slightly for a number of different reasons. Back in 2014, the school board went through a request for proposal process to select a financial advisor. The district made a decision to select PMA. PMA has been sharing draft referendum financial plans with the school board. It's important to note that additional plans will be created as the referendum planning process moves forward throughout 2022. So the community and board members will continue to see different plans as the plans evolve over the next several months. But you will see some consistencies as these plans are developed. As an example, on the left-hand side of this plan, and any plans that we bring forward, you are going to see the concept of the school board paying down debt. At some point this spring, working with the school board's budget committee, a decision will be made as to when to pay down some of the district's existing debt. That will occur sometime within the next 3 to 4 months, depending on our cash flow. But every plan that we present will show the district paying down debt. The middle portion of a financial plan will show the district issuing new debt. And the new debt would be issued over a series of years to spread out the cost so that as a board, you can have a new debt spread out over 20 years so that future residents also participate in paying back the cost of today's school construction. And then to the far right of any financial plan, there's a couple of important concepts. The first one is, again, the goal of a consistent tax rate across time. So our financial advisors understand that's a goal of the board and will be working on plans to make sure that that goal is accomplished. And then secondly, any plan that we present to the community is going to include a combination of what's called a capital referendum or debt that we have to borrow, and an operational referendum, which is a referendum that supports the district's annual operational budget. And for those that are new to the school referendum process, the reason for an operational referendum is when a new school is constructed, one of the things that the school board always takes a look at is what are the operational costs associated with that new school, and what is the best way to support the needs of that new school as well as the existing schools. So that's called an operational question. So it's important for us as a district, when talking with the community, to factor both of those referendum questions in. We can't say to the community that our goal is to have a consistent tax rate and then ignore the operational costs that come along with a successful referendum. So on the right-hand side of this, of any financial plan you will see, will include the acknowledgement that there are costs operationally that goes along with the issuance of new debt. So you will see us always talking about both. The plan in front of you shows new debt in the $150 million range issued over 4 years, as well as an operational referendum that is up to $6 million. This is, again, just one example of a plan that could be approved without increasing the tax rate for the district. We will continue to engage the board members with additional plans as the process moves forward. So we'll talk a little bit more about community engagement in just a couple minutes.
Can you just touch real quick, Steve, on the other variable we have down here is property value growth?
Sure.
And that we have a very conservative number in there.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. So when this financial plan was being presented to the budget committee and facility committee, one of the questions the board members had was, what has been the historical property value growth increase in our community? Looking back over the last 20 years, that's been over 5%. This plan assumes growth of only 3% for a period of time, and then 0% thereafter. So anyone who looks at this plan should view it as conservative in nature and very likely underestimating the actual property growth that will likely occur over that time frame. And for anyone who has followed school referendums in the Waunakee community in the past 20 years, you will know it has always been a goal of the school board to show a financial plan like this, and then ultimately have the costs for the community be quite a bit lower because of the fact that growth has always exceeded what we have estimated in these plans. So it is very important to note that, Randy, thank you, that this is still considered conservative financial planning, and the board still has that goal of having the actual financial plan come in at a lower cost than what we described to the community during the referendum process. Moving on to a timeline and what the community can expect to see between January of 2022 and all the way until a potential referendum on November 8th of 2022. There's a number of steps that would occur between January and November. There are some key components in a timeline. Those include a deadline for the school board to actually adopt a resolution that would go in front of the community. You could see that that is occurring during the month of August. Another key component is really engagement with the community in a community-wide survey and other opportunities besides this evening. Those are included on this timeline. It's noted as preliminary, because as you know, we have to be flexible over the next, 7 to 8 months as these plans evolve and the discussions take place. This is one example of what that timeline could look like. Critical milestones, where we are going from here. First of all, as board members, you saw the comprehensive report prepared by Mark Roffers earlier in January. Right now, we are engaged in the development of a community survey. Back in 2014, for that referendum, the school board engaged with a statewide leader. The name of the firm is School Perceptions, to engage the community to really understand the thoughts regarding the 2014 referendum. The board also engaged School Perceptions in the planning process prior to pausing because of COVID, and we've re-engaged that discussion. The survey is currently being developed with the idea of sharing a first draft with the school board at the February board meeting, asking the board to approve that survey at your March board meeting, and then launch the survey after spring break so that you as board members can see the results in May. That will then give the board opportunities to develop the referendum plans between the time that you receive the survey results and when the final vote would need to take place in August. So the timing of this process is really sketched out in a manner to lead us towards a successful planning process by the end of October for resolution authorization by the school board. Diving a little deeper, there's going to be a number of opportunities to engage the Waunakee area stakeholders, obviously including this evening. The next major feedback component is going to be the survey. On the slide, you see what an example survey looks like. This is the one that we are developing right now to share a little bit more information with you. The community survey is going to be asking our community for some high-level feedback on the topics that really matter to the school board as you're developing the specifics of this plan. As an example, location of the new middle school. Randy referenced that earlier. It's critically important that we understand the community's thoughts on that topic. The topic of renovating, expanding Heritage, or constructing a replacement Heritage Elementary School. Community support for a capital and operational referendum question with a goal of a consistent tax rate across years. It's important for us to help the public understand what the financial plan has been from the school board for the last 4 years and to gauge public support in that plan of having a consistent tax rate across years. So these are all some of the major themes that we are building into the survey. It's incredibly important that as board members, you have the opportunity to weigh into that survey, which is why Randy wants to bring you a first draft of that in February to make sure that we are on track with asking the questions that you really want feedback on. So you will have 2 opportunities to take a look at that. We're also going to be talking with you at the February board meeting about the possibility of a special board meeting later on in the month of February, completely focused just on this topic. So we will talk more about that at the February board meeting. One important piece of information to share is Annie has been doing a wonderful job building out our Referendum 2022 website. Why that matters to community members is tonight we were only able to share portions of the information that we already have been gathering on this topic. The presentation that we referenced earlier this month from planning consultant Mark Roffers is a 50-plus slide PowerPoint presentation filled with very important data about the future of our community and our school district. That entire presentation is on that webpage, available for anyone who wants to look at it, as well as all of the information that we're going to be providing surrounding the topic of a potential referendum, as well as we have built an email address where the community is welcome to reach us at any time. So you see the email address on the screen. It's WCSD with an underscore fall 2022 referendum. We welcome your questions. So if you're viewing this tonight and you have some thoughts tomorrow that you want to share, or you have a question, please use that email address. We're going to be monitoring it, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. And we're happy to take your questions or your feedback. So please take some time, look at this referendum page, and let us know what your thoughts are. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Randy.
All right, yeah. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. I know we're going into a lot of detail here tonight. There are some questions. I think I addressed some of them, but let me just go through the ones that I know that either came in ahead of time or that were shared with me, and then we'll open it up for any of the Q&A that either come through the webinar or people here in the room who can come up live. One of the questions was with regards to the school property we own on Woodland and Peaceful Valley Parkway, and what could that be utilized for? It's a 24-acre parcel, I believe. It's not large enough for a middle school, but it does have the capacity to serve as an elementary school. So as we look at a fourth elementary school in probably phase 3 of our planning process, that may be a future site for an elementary building, particularly as you start to look at Mark Roffer's projections of where growth could be happening in the community, and some of it continuing to happen to the south of on our school district. The other question came in about, well, if you're looking at land, well, what other land do you have available? I mean, certainly that's a piece. I know that we've been asked to add this to a future facilities committee agenda and also a future board meeting agenda, and Steve and I would like to be talking to the board about potentially an RFP that could go out if we're interested in kind of vetting out what options we have for other land sites around our community that potentially, if our survey comes out that you want the middle school to be located somewhere else other than the center of town or at the heritage site, we need to have some options for that. So that'll be a conversation we'll be having with the board moving forward here in the short term. Also received some feedback from one of our staff members, particularly around the middle school physical education and weight room area. Just looking at making sure that we build that large enough to accommodate multiple kind of sections that you could have, kind of like we did at the intermediate school, where you can have multiple classes within that space, and also looking at the utilization of our weight room, starting at the middle school with kids after school. Currently, we have over 60 kids per night that are utilizing that facility, and it's obviously quite small at the middle school, and wanting to have a vision that's similar in size to what we have at the intermediate school. Question with regards to the point when we transition from into the middle school and high school becoming one campus. The question was, how long do I think the middle school building would sit vacant? I don't think it would sit vacant at all. I think that at the point of that transition, there's going to be programs that are going to move. Most immediately, probably things from our teaching and learning center that would make some sense to move over there. I know, Brian, at the high school, you're already short on family consumer ed space. So, and then also looking at just things that we have with all of our lab classrooms, science classrooms, etc. I think over the next, we're looking forward probably 4 to 5 years. A lot of things can evolve and change. And I think the pieces that we're looking at is what makes sense educationally to put there. But I don't believe that site's going to sit vacant at all. I see that as a piece that will definitely be having programs in it from the day that the campus becomes kind of utilized as one. Another question was with regards to the exceed the cap question and kind of what's included in that. That's yet to be determined, but as Steve said, generally it's really designed to be a piece that helps us on an operational end. As far as meeting the needs of any additional space. I also see this as a piece that we're going to be looking at as we want to expand our programs. as far as things that we want to add to our instructional programs or other programs and the costs associated with that. Budget Committee is having us move through a 3-year planning cycle for some of our visions for the district. I think tapping into that work in order to articulate what are some of the things that we want to expand into. And then also per our survey that will be going out, we're going to be asking some questions as far as multiple ideas as far as what you could utilize exceeding the cap dollars for, and getting some feedback from the community on some of those various uses. I think I've hit most of the questions that were submitted to me ahead of time. Annie, are there any on the Q&A or any that came in via email?
I did see a hand, but now I don't see it. Where does staffing fall into the referendum?
Oh, that's a good question. I think staffing falls, I think you can look at staffing as 2 pieces. One is, as you want to expand programs or add new programs or expand opportunities, that's a place that's potentially there. So as you look at things like, we've added interventionists, we have a growing need for things like our bilingual program, we have pieces like Gifted and Talented or our Pathways program that we have some needs that we want to add to. Some of those programs certainly could fit into there. I think there's often a question we're asked is, where does any sort of other supports for staff and salary and benefit type things? That's a piece that we'll vet out probably through our survey. Won't immediately utilizing the old middle school prior to connecting to the high school create a lot of inefficient travel for students, both in terms of time of travel as well as outdoor travel during inclement weather. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Brian. I mean, I think we already have kids that are moving between those, so it's certainly a piece that we have some experience with that. I mean, it's definitely a part that we have to take into consideration as that moves forward, and I think that's also going to be part of kind of the 3rd phase of planning here. I mean, I think by the time we move to that, we could also very much be at that 3rd stage of planning and being at the point where we need to bring that forward. But definitely there are some pieces that we have to kind of work out there, also kind of with as far as not only the connectivity to it, but also some of the structure of that facility as far as the entryways and some of the other areas. So you bring up a great point. That's a piece that we have to work out as part of our planning, particularly as we look at how that becomes part of our larger campus. At this point, some of that is part of phase 3. But it's certainly a piece that we'll take into consideration and see if there's any interest in trying to move any of those conversations forward. Another question that came in is, can you please outline expectations for outdoor classrooms in the new site development? I think generally what I would see is that's definitely been a piece that we've continued to look at as far as how can you utilize our space creatively. At the intermediate school, we've created some outdoor areas where classrooms can move outside and instruction can take place in those environments. I think that's what the question is really alluding to, but certainly we value the flexibility of our outside spaces to utilize those for our students. And I know as you travel around and look at some of the more modern school buildings, they definitely include those into their planning and construction. Can you please outline expectations for possible hiring timeline for additional support staff? Can assure us that teachers, counselors, psychologists, and social workers will not exceed state ratio expectations. I think that question is really a piece that's part of our 3-year planning process, is trying to look at what our staffing needs. I can assure you that taking a look at things like counselors, psychologists, and social workers is certainly within our 3-year planning discussions, and I think those type of questions will get vetted out as we present those to the Budget Committee here in the next month.
We have one more email. Will this referendum, if approved, be safe from future board alterations, or is this referendum static?
No, good question. So I think the question that Annie read was, is this referendum something that's, so once it's decided upon, Steve went through, I'm going to go back here a second, Steve. Well, can you put the
Yep.
slides back up there, Annie, for a sec? Yeah, thank you. Let me go there. I want to go back. There we go. I got it. I think. One more. Here we go. When you start to look at when we have to put together our referendum question, that happens this summer. So our deadline to adopt a resolution is August 30th. So sometime in that July, August timeframe, we are going to adopt a resolution that will actually be what the referendum scope is. And it certainly will have, many of those pieces will be static at that moment. I mean, if we're building a middle school, the general cost and size of the middle school, the siting of where we would want it to be, et cetera, are going to have to be generally decided as we move into that question. As far as an exceed the cap question, as far as the values, because we'll need to be, that deadline is the language that will then go on the ballot for the referendum in November. Once we get that approved, I mean, certainly there's things that can change just from a perspective of a construction timeline. I mean, if you wanted to do all of that in one referendum, or if you broke it into multiple referendums, that's a question that the board is going to have. But things obviously adapt over time, but the general concepts we're talking about are relatively static once the board makes their decision in August, as far as the type of work and the projects that we'll be moving forward with. Our architect team, EUA, and our construction team from Vogel Brothers are working with us and continuing to work with us to kind of finalize down the scope of which then gets approved as we move forward in August. Anything to add to that, Steve?
Yeah, if I could add that in state law, the capital referendum question is locked in. So once the board makes a decision, approves the language, the funds have to be spent in that manner. The operational referendum question is always more flexible. It's going to ask for a specific dollar amount, either on a permanent basis or a short-term basis, which is called recurring. But on an annual basis, the school board will make a decision during the annual budgeting process regarding the budget, the property tax levy, and how to utilize those funds. So the operational piece absolutely is discussed and approved every year. Because as an example, next fall, the board could choose to not utilize all of the 2.1 million that was approved by the public 2 years ago for a maximum of 5 years. That is an annual decision that the board does make. So that component is not permanent. It is reviewed annually.
Any other ones, Annie?
No, that is the.
Randy, maybe
Yeah, that's kind of where I'd like to go now, is kind of to the people. And what we'd like you to do, if you have a question or a comment you'd like to bring forward, is to come up to the mic. And is there anyone who would like to speak or ask a question? Yeah, you can just.
All right. Hi, I'm Christine Hamilton, and I just have a few things. First thing, can everybody hear me? Is that okay? Okay. First thing, has anybody talked to St. John's in the Archdiocese about butting up against the cemetery in 20 years in this school? Just wondering, I don't know if anybody's brought that question up, but you're starting to push towards the church if this gets bigger and bigger in the middle of town there. And I don't know, being a Ripon and Schmitz, you're not going to dig out my relatives.
Mhm.
Just saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Next thing, more about staffing, diversity hiring, special needs areas, more focus on proper food service areas, which we've already worked on, and they need more room. More focus on low-income housing. I hear a lot about Savannah Village and Southbridge. What about the people who live in this community and work at McDonald's every day? Work at Taco Bell every day? Who's going to get their children to school? Who's going to make sure their children are doing okay? Because I work for a transportation company and we're struggling to try and find ways to get kids in this district to school every day. That shouldn't happen in this district. Ever. Ever. And just, yeah, more focus on people who maybe don't have the cha-ching, but are in this community and are working hard every single day. to make sure when you come through the drive-throughs, when you go to the gas stations, you're served. Because it's hard. It's very hard. And then you gotta get your kids to school in the morning. Difficult. So we're talking about building new schools and we're talking about building more sports arenas. But we aren't getting the kids that need to go to school every day today. Just recently, we got vans for kids with special needs. Just recently. Unacceptable in Waunakee, Wisconsin, to my mind. So I think we need to focus on some other things before we worry about having sports arenas and more, football. We're worried about the track, but we have kids who can't get to school every day. Priorities. That's just my opinion. Thank you.
I guess a couple things I just want to add in there. I mean, I think from the housing perspective, one of the things we are trying to look at is, when Mark did his piece, it was looking at all the housing across, including the changing dynamics of some of the housing and kind of looking at, we're really looking at projections.
Yes,
And certainly that's a piece that we're looking at. How do we service all of this? I'd like to kind of talk to you if you feel afterwards, if there's a concern about kids not getting to school.
Absolutely.
Some of the things, you brought up a great point about the vans. And partially that was brought forward but to the board because of the lack of bus drivers. We have a very huge shortage of bus drivers, and being able to service all of our special needs students who required door-to-door transportation, we weren't able to do.
Door through door, not just door to door, door through door. They go in the house.
Correct.
They get the kids in the vehicle.
Right. And I think part of what we looked at for a solution to that was we actually purchased some of our own vans to specifically then send staff out. It allowed us to kind of work through the shortage of bus drivers and also be able to provide a service to them. Otherwise, we were having parents have to provide that transportation on their own, which wasn't okay. So that was part of why we brought that forward.
Yep.
But I'd be happy to touch base with you after.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, comments? Robert?
Someone else go first for once instead of me. Robert McPherson. So I do want to echo Christine's comments. I have a lot of concerns that if we take the elementary school out of the downtown area, that we're going to have sort of an equity access issue. Let's be honest here, people who have kids, if they don't fall into a certain income bracket, they're not going to be over in the Arboretum area. I know that slide that mentioned Savannah and Southbridge, where I currently live. And houses are still pretty expensive in those areas for new families, younger families that are coming in there, unless you have a higher paying job. So if we are, if we're looking at taking the elementary school out of the areas that are more affordable in the village, it just seems like we're just putting a burden on people for a transportation aspect, that they would have to go out further out to Woodland Drive, since you can't exactly walk there, whereas you could walk from the downtown streets. The second item that I'd also like to see on the I shouldn't say parent, taxpayer survey, would just be that there is consideration for increased pay for teachers, paraeducators, support staff, things of that nature. I know that we've kind of talked about it, and that it would be in the operational part of the referendum. I think it should just be very clear that if it's in a survey, that that's what that could impact, and maybe test the capacity for people within the village to want to. I know that we talk about trying to keep the tax rate consistent, which I think a lot of people appreciate and I appreciate, but just to gauge the feeling, it's a survey. It doesn't need to necessarily scare people away. If you just say, hey, if we decide to pay, I'm throwing a number out here, by the way, so please don't quote me, but if you say, we're going to pay 10% more to all support staff, this would impact your taxes this way, would you be okay with it? That type of a question. Not that you're going to actively engage in it, but at least you would know the community's feelings on it. And then the third thing that I would mention is just that I'm not seeing a lot of discussion about moving any sort of the future planning out towards the Bishop's Bay direction. Eventually there's going to be a lot of new housing over in that direction, and it just seems concerning that we seem to be, trust me, I live in Waunakee, so I want Waunakee to be great, but I know that WCSD serves other municipalities, and I think it's about time that we at least seriously consider putting some sort of building over in a different municipality, so that not everything needs to be within the village. Again, that addresses driving distance equity and things like that for parents that have to shuttle their kids around. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Other questions, comments? Okay.
My name is Anthony Mano. I have 3 children in the district. What I would like to propose for the board's consideration for the facilities committee is 2 scenarios. One being the referendum doesn't pass and we have the reality of the issues at the middle school and the elementary school. And the other scenario is option 3 passes and we have a overcapacity middle school for at least 5 years before construction is completed. I'm proposing that the board considers an annex structure that would be located east of the football end zone. There would be three levels, and on the top level would have 4 classrooms and a large breakout space to be used as the middle school extra capacity in the interim. And then once the new middle school is built, then as you'll see in the orange slide, that would be the connection point for the elevated walkway. The other issue would be at the elementary level is if the referendum doesn't pass and we do have elementary capacity issues, that the board considers an addition at Prairie to meet those needs. So I'd be available to talk to the facilities committee for further information if they'd like, but I just want to get it in front of you now and then on the agenda.
Tony, did you also hand out, I have the one with the high school, it's the one with Prairie as well?
There you go.
All right, thank you.
Good.
I have some extras.
So, thank you. Thank you. Any questions, Randy?
All right, you bet, super, thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions, Andy, that have come in?
Is the board proposing that after the referendum, the district would redraw the elementary school lines similar to how Sun Prairie did?
I think part of the question was, do we foresee the district redrawing kind of the elementary boundary lines after the referendum, similar to how other districts have done it? I think that's going to be a question as kind of where the building would be sited. I mean, where it would sit. I mean, certainly if, for example, just to kind of play this forward, if it was within if you did put the heritage out by the intermediate school, that's still the intermediate school attendance boundary. It wouldn't necessarily immediately propagate that you needed to make that change. But certainly if it was sitting somewhere else, it's going to require us to redraw those lines. Certainly when you add a 4th elementary in phase 3, that's going to precipitate the need to redraw lines specifically at that point. So I think the question will be is there anything with this referendum that's going to prompt the need to do that? Or is that a piece that's going to require kind of a rework once we get to the 4th elementary building being built in the community, which is in the future? Any other ones, Annie?
There's one in the Q&A. I'll pull it up here so you can.
Middle school building capacity is listed at 663 with a note 2 that mentions a potential additional capacity of 70. Yeah, that's, if you want to see what the capacity is with the portables, you could potentially add 70 on top of the 663. The note talks of 2 variables, classroom utilization and portables. The 2 portables, 4 classrooms would seem to achieve that 70 value. Is there an opportunity to gain additional capacity by altering, increasing the utilization of the existing building? So the utilization is really went through with Jeff Keenis and the folks from Epstein Union Architects, and they took a look at how the building is currently being utilized, and as far as the spaces and the capacities within those buildings, and they used what was called a 70% value for, is that correct, Steve? 70% utilization value. So that's really trying to show that every classroom, certainly when it's used to its capacity, it's not full 100% of every minute of every single school day, just because of just how the fluctuations of students' schedules move forward. So, I mean, certainly if you have greater utilization, you can have more students there, but I think part of that is also taking about what are you going to do with class sizes. So if you remember on the slide where I was talking about the capacity being 663, and we're currently at the 652. I mean, we could put all those students in the current building without utilizing the portables. The portables are helping to keep our class sizes down. The utilization value is really kind of how we're structured as a school and how we're operating. Some of those things just are not necessarily feasible to make great shifts in utilization percentages based on how we use the space instructionally. So this was a study piece that was done extensively with Jeff and with members of our EUA team. I know, Steve, you were part of some of those discussions. Do you have anything necessarily to add to that?
No, I was just gonna just reiterate your point, Randy, on the class size is really what matters the most, as opposed to the utilization of a classroom, because a classroom is always going to have 1 or 2 periods during the day where it's not scheduled, right? The teacher has prep time and it's not being utilized at that period of time, but the class size itself and the school board policy on class size is what really matters for the utilization of a building as far as the student capacity. And that's where the focus was. And as Randy said, one of the major learning points from the process to confirm the capacity of the middle school was the fact that we've been able to keep class sizes below the board's maximum class size at the middle school by utilizing the portable classrooms. If they weren't there, the kids could all fit in the school. It's just the class sizes would then approach the school board's maximum class sizes for the middle school level. So it's more about class size than utilization.
Yeah, and I think Brian had a follow-up. The class size, I'm sorry, the class size is utilized, what class size is utilized in the 663? I think that's the actual class sizes we have right now, Brian. That's what they utilized in that number, is that correct?
In the school board policy.
Yeah. So utilizing the school board policy, it kept us under the maximum, but I think it was also at what our current levels were.
And one more email. Is there a goal or expectation for renewable energy being a component to these plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is there a plan to utilize renewable energy? I think to the degree that we're able to. When we put together the plan for the intermediate school, we have geothermal heating and cooling, we have solar units on the roof, we've done some green roofing areas, and we also utilize daylighting throughout the buildings, and then certainly all of the energy efficiency is with lighting and electrical. So those are all things that I'm hoping that we can utilize in our pieces moving forward, because it's been extremely successful at the intermediate building. Any others, Annie? Do we have any others in the room here tonight?
Randy,
Yep.
one thing you brought up was about that the 24 acres on Woodland Peaceful Valley site is not large enough for a middle school.
Yeah.
And I think it might be helpful to know what is the acreage available next to the intermediate school for a school, and what's the acreage that the middle school is currently using, and what's the acreage at the current heritage site.
Okay. So you'd like to know the acreage of all of our, kind of like how.
I think that would help inform to say what is feasible, what can be sized in those spaces.
Yeah, and I think part of it's also kind of what do you have to add to the site? So
Right.
if you, so.
So when you're saying that the middle school can't fit in Peaceful Valley,
Right,
why is that? What the public should be able to see, well, what acreage is necessary for a middle school and why?
right.
And why that also would not work out next to the intermediate.
Yep, we can bring that. We can show some of those pieces. I know we have some of our team members on the call here tonight, so we'll make sure that we bring some of those pieces back, and we can probably show some illustrations of that.
I think the advantage you get with the middle school where it's at right now is you're utilizing all the high school space.
Right.
You know, you get fields, you get track, you get, everything, and no matter where you put the middle school, I don't think you're gonna be putting all those amenities. You don't, unless you buy a 100-acre farm someplace.
Right. Yeah, I think if you're hitting, and just kind of, if you're looking at 30, 40 acres, you definitely have room to put some of those other amenities. So that's the kind of space you're looking for. If you're looking at, when we're looking at kind of putting out a request for proposals for land, I think you're looking at those larger tracts of land versus more the 20-acre piece certainly can hold most likely the physical body of the school, but it's not going to hold some of the amenities that you have there. And it also gets tight with your parking, et cetera. So we can bring that piece back and make sure that the facilities committee and the board can take a look at that. And I think that's going to be one of the things, Dave, you've asked on a future meeting is to talk about land. I think it fits into that piece as well.
But I think if you do look for land, you should be looking for bigger sites, maybe even beyond 40 acres.
Right.
Because, that gives you room to grow on that particular site.
Yep. The concept Steve and I had that we'll bring to the facilities committee is it's really more of a community RFP that would see kind of who has land available. I think that addresses, and that would be within the boundaries of the school district to see what options are potential, and then to bring those pieces forward. Because I think that's a piece we're going to need, particularly as our survey information comes forward, because if that is a desire of the community to have something to keep the elementary in the center of town and put the middle school somewhere else, we're going to need some options to look at. So that'll be a piece we'll be talking about with the facilities committee and with the board in the very near future.
Jack, it was difficult to hear on the webinar what you just said. That might encourage the board members to speak up.
And I think what Jack said was this, that as we look at land in the future, we should look at larger parcels that can accommodate the types of needs that we have.
It's hard to believe that people can't hear me.
Okay, any other comments? Anybody in the room or any other through? Is there anything in the chat down there, or is that something different?
That's me to the panelists.
All right.
So no chats, no hands.
Okay.
I think that kind of ends
Yeah, 1
our
second.
session.
The email address if people can reach out to us.
Yeah, just the last thing before we close, Joan, please reach out to us if you have questions. And I think we put the email in our presentation here with regards to the referendum. You can please reach out to us. This presentation is found online and will be on our webpage so that you can find the information about that. So please reach out if there are questions and we'll direct them accordingly.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone who attended in person, online. We appreciate being able to engage and bring this information to you. This is a hugely important decision that we are facing for this year. So thank you.
Good. Awesome. Thank you.
Can I have that as a copy of the elementary school?
Actually,